from Microbe TV, this is TWiP, This Week in Parasitism, episode 220, recorded on August 17, 2023. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and joining me today from Fort Lee, New Jersey, Dixon Despommier.
Hello, Vincent and everybody else. I'm glad to be back. Just got back from a wonderful vacation in Montana, celebrating my wife's 80th birthday, by the way. And everybody had a good time.
Also joining us from New York, Daniel Griffin.
Hello, everyone.
And from Glasgow, Scotland, Christina Naula.
Hello, everybody. I've also been traveling, been to Norway with my daughter, which was beautiful. And now I'm back in sunny Glasgow.
Dixon, let's try pushing
How
it
do you
down.
Like this? Yeah, I just did.
A little more.
More?
And,
how's that?
Okay, so that's good, because your breathing is just, you need to stop breathing.
Yeah.
Many people have told me that, by the way. You're not the only one.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But
Not
here's
on the
people
show,
who
though,
care
please.
about you
I'm
telling
still
you to stop
thinking about
breathing.
it. I'm thinking about it.
All right. First thing, two things I want to tell you before we start our clinical case. If you enjoy our podcast, we'd love your support. And I'm saying this up at the beginning of the shows now because many of you leave before the end. And it's really important that we have your support. Just like antibodies in a vaccinated individual, support for Microbe TV is contracting, not waning, contracting. And we need to remind you to support us if you want to see good science discussions, not fake science, not wrong information that you hear from other people. We need your support. Go to microbe.tv/contribute. And also, I want to tell everyone that we have a new program at Microbe TV. It's called Matters Microbial, and it's by Mark O. Martin from the University of Puget Sound. Every episode, he speaks with another microbiologist for about 20 minutes about their work. So check it out at microbe.tv/mm. All right, Daniel, what do we have as far as a case goes?
All right. Well, as I like to say, for those of you tuning back in and those of you tuning in the first time, on our last episode, we discussed the case of a 73-year-old male with no significant past medical history, right? He's one of these otherwise healthy 70-year-olds. He is referred to the emergency department for fever, lethargy, and pretty progressive weakness over the past 2 weeks. Now, Thursday of the prior week, he went to his primary care provider. Blood work was performed. The CBC, the complete blood count, demonstrated inclusions in his red blood cells. Labs demonstrated anemia, so low hematocrit, low hemoglobin, thrombocytopenia, so low platelets, mildly elevated total bilirubin, and ALT. He was started on oral azithromycin and atovaquone. On Saturday, however, he has not noted much improvement. He was seen in our outpatient infectious disease office on Monday. At this point, he was having fevers as high as 102, continued chills, dark urine, occasionally breaking out in sweats. Now, normally this patient rides his bike 15 miles a day and runs 3 miles a day. He's widowed, but now he barely has the energy to walk a few feet. He's actually brought into the office in a wheelchair. A little more history. This is a gentleman from Queens, New York. There's been no recent excursions outside of Queens, and those runs of which he speaks occur in a park in Queens, actually a place where I've often gone hiking with my family. And I love this. He denies any bug bites, no bug bites, no tick bites, no rashes, no blood transfusions in the past year.
Well, about the only thing I believe there is the blood transfusions.
I was thinking the same.
I'm always entertained. I've never been bit by a bug.
All right. Dixon, can you take the first one?
I would love to. Galen writes, "Hello, doctors. I'm hoping to make it before the deadline this time. I've been listening since I was in the Peace Corps in Uganda. I had a case of schistosomiasis in 2011, and I've been a faithful listener since then. I'll have to keep this brief as I'm going to work on the night shift on labor and delivery. But I think this patient has a case of babesiosis and unfortunately sounds like a fairly severe case. The RBC inclusions and treatment suggest babesiosis. His other lab abnormalities and signs and symptoms are also seen to varying degrees, including dark urine from hemoglobinuria due to severe intravascular hemolysis. How profound was his anemia and thrombocytopenia? Was his poor mobility due to pain, weakness, dyspnea? Though he denies it, he may have had a tick bite that he's not aware of. Malaria is less likely given a recent travel out of the country, given no travel, recent travel out of the country. Thanks so much for the hours of learning. I'm always hopeful to get some hands-on experience with parasitic diseases as a rural family medicine resident, but so far, nothing beyond a few cases of Giardia. Cheers, Galen."
Christina.
Hello, TWiPers. Oh, Chad writes, "Hello, TWiPers. Daniel, thank you for sharing another case study. Atavacon is used to treat toxoplasmosis, malaria, pneumocystis, pneumonia, and finally, in conjunction with azithromycin in mild to moderate cases of babesiosis. My guess is Babesia microti. This newly wheelchair-bound patient in this case is beyond mild to moderate and should be started on IV clindamycin with oral quinine or IV quinidine. Thanks, Chad."
Daniel.
All right. Martha, who already has a book, writes us, "Dear TWiPers, I hope this letter finds you well and parasite-free. I'm attempting to be a bit less late to the case. In the case of the previously fit and well 70-year-old man with progressive weakness and fevers who has anemia and thrombocytopenia, the question that was not asked was, what was the shape of the erythrocyte inclusion? And does he take a dip in a vat of DEET prior to his runs through the woodlands? I find it unusual for 7 decades with no arthropod has shown any interest in him. Since we have been told he has no significant medical history, I assume he is immune competent as much as one can be at 70 years old, and that he has a spleen. If the shape of the inclusion is of a Maltese cross, then in spite of the lack of tick attack history, I think this is a case of babesiosis, which is usually caused by Babesia microti, carried by the tick Ixodes scapularis, formerly known as Ixodes damani. The thrombocytopenia, hemolytic anemia, and hemoglobinuria all weigh in favor of this. Also suggestive is the prescription for azithromycin and atovaquone. Since this is such a severe case, it is probably worthwhile considering co-infection with Borrelia burgdorferi, which is carried by the same tick. Fortunately, azithromycin is one of the recommended treatments for Lyme disease. We are not told how long he has been on azithromycin and atovaquone. Has it been long enough that we need to consider a resistant organism? I look forward to the discussion of this case. Best wishes to all of you, Martha.
Dixon. Oh, no, it's me. Paul writes, "The case of the healthy, fit older man with a febrile illness, hemolytic anemia, low platelet count, abnormal liver tests, extreme fatigue, no travel history, living in Queens with outdoor activities and parks is most consistent with disease caused by Babesia microti. The diagnostic clue of red cell inclusions, red blood cell inclusions, followed by prescription of azithromycin and atovaquone suggests that the inclusions seen on a standard thin blood smear, Gimsa or Wright stain, were variable-shaped ring forms of Babesia trophozoites. Rarely, a tetrad of merozoites are seen in a Maltese cross formation, which is considered diagnostic or pathonomic for Babesia. Babesia microti is endemic in New York City with 86 cases identified in 2020, spread by the Ixodes scapularis tick, which can also carry B. burgdorferi, causing Lyme disease, and Anaplasma phagocytophilium, causing humid granulocytic and anaplasmosis. The nymph tick transmits Babesia to humans, and the bite is often not recognized as the nymphs are less than 2 millimeters in size or poppy seed size. Hence, the patient did not recall a bite. Most cases of Babesia improve within 2 days of treatment, but this patient was not improved. There's several possibilities. The only reported risk factor for more severe disease is his age, but the possibility of underlying immunocompromising illness should be considered. No clues are given to such an underlying condition. He could be co-infected with one of the other pathogens mentioned above. However, the course is not compatible with Lyme disease, but could be anaplasmosis, which is much rarer in New York City. Next steps would be including confirming the diagnosis with PCR and treating the patients with IV azithromycin and oral atovaquone or IV clindamycin and quinine sulfate and considering exchange transfusion. Thanks. I learned a lot. Wow.
I feel like she's been listening to Bran Barker. Finishes every episode.
Thanks a lot.
I learned a lot.
That's right.
Daniel, what is exchange transfusion?
So when someone has a high level of parasitemia, what they'll actually do is remove the infected red blood cells and replace them with uninfected red blood cells.
How do you do that without killing the patient?
It is actually a device. So out are coming the bad red blood cells, and in are going the good red blood cells. And actually, exchange transfusion is something that has been used and is indicated in certain contexts in Babesia, but also in other infections such as malaria.
So you take out, and as you're taking out, you're putting fresh ones in.
Yeah.
And so at some point, you're taking out fresh ones, but then you stop, right?
Yeah, it's kind of going on at the same time. It's not like you take out a bunch, give new. It's occurring at the same time.
So how do you know when you've done it enough? Is it just a fixed time?
No, so you're actually performing exchange transfusion till you get below a certain percent parasitemia. So there's a certain percent threshold at which you initiate and a certain percent threshold that you're targeting.
And how do you assess the parasitemia? By microscopy or?
Yeah, you actually look under a microscope and you can count. So how many per high power field?
And how long does this typically take?
It's not very long.
Cool.
So, yeah.
All right. Thank you. Dixon, you next.
Yes, Marcus writes, Dear TWiPers, your cases may give me nervous tics, but I suppose that is my Maltese cross to bear.
Very good.
Well done.
I worry my case guesses from my private email don't get through, so this time I'm trying from work again. So my patient is a healthy man, no travel history, denies insect bites, though active runner, cyclists, likely bitten at some point without noticing. 2-week history of fatigue and fibrillia, pancytopenia, RBC inclusions, likely hemolysis with hemoglobinuria. Assuming that the RBC inclusions are microbial, though, howl jolly buddies in a thank you for correcting that, a splenia would be relevant here. I once learned that the erythrocyte is an uncommon target for pathogens as it has little intracellular machinery, doesn't replicate, and has a lifespan of only 120 days. Indeed, we only have 3 important intracellular pathogens of erythrocytes, malaria, Bartonella, and Babesia. Though possible with airport malaria here, Babesia seems more likely, and Bartonella wouldn't quite fit with TWiP. Mm-hmm. Babesia alone, however, rarely causes such severe disease. Severe illness is usually associated with immune compromise, as in previously mentioned asplenia, or co-infections with Lyme disease or anaplasmosis. In co-infection with anaplasma seems more likely if he runs have taken him to Long Island, though it may well be severe Lyme. As we all know, these 3 tick-borne diseases are on the rise in the Northeast United States. So that is my guess for this case. Babesiosis with possible immune compromise or anaplasma/Borrelia co-infection. Relevant ELISA, blood PCR, and a proper look at the blood and Buffy coat smears would inform further care. Though atovaquone plus azithromycin are first choices in mild babesiosis, quinine and clindamycin are preferred in severe disease. Furthermore, doxycycline should be considered for anaplasma/Borrelia. Writing you on a cool sunny day in this holiday in southern Norway. Well, you might have run across Christina, where there is plenty of Lyme and TBE is on the rise. But to my knowledge, no Babesia or malaria, though there are Anopheles mosquitoes. Could you, Daniel, describe what TBE is?
Oh,
Tick-borne encephalitis.
yeah, which is really in certain parts of northern Europe, they actually will vaccinate against tick-borne encephalitis. Actually, part of the gene series. So
okay,
Christina.
Inge writes, Dear doctors of TWiP, it's been a sunnier day than the average all week with temperatures just above 20 Celsius. We've had a lot of rain in the Netherlands. The emergency department where I've recently started is finally calming down on my evening shift, so I have some time to train my brain on this new case. Thanks again for such an interesting paper on malaria and the most recent case presented. I must say, my first thoughts immediately went to malaria with inclusion bodies in red blood cells, anemia and thrombocytopenia, and the typical chills with fever. I didn't find the clinical course of 2 weeks fitting, nor the location of residence of the patient, an absence of significant travel history. So I took to the books and will put my guess towards babesiosis. Being from Northern Europe, this is not a disease I was familiar with, but it seems to fit the picture well. With similar attack on the RBCs causing inclusion bodies, hemolytic anemia with hemoglobinuria, and a milder picture. It being prevalent in the state of New York and transmitted by ticks, our patient has probably received it during one of his outings to the park. To confirm the diagnosis, I would like to have a thin blood smear done with Wright's or Giemsa stains. Azithromycin and atavaquone is a very fitting therapy, and I would suggest, if the patient is increasingly ill or with dangerous levels of anemia and thrombocytopenia, to keep him at it for a while longer. Of course, switching to clindamycin and quinine can be considered, also IV options. With malaria being somewhat similar in presentation, it would be my preference to do a thick blood smear along with these tests. I wouldn't find it very likely epidemiologically, but with climate change causing mosquitoes to behave differently, we should be aware of the theoretical possibility. I am very curious to hear whether my diagnosis is correct or not, and what your advice on treatment with the current presentation would be, and whether it would qualify me for winning a book, which I haven't as of yet. Would I meet this patient in my ID? I would feel much more comfortable consulting the infectious disease specialist on this before acting out of my ideas. Of course, kind regards. P.S. I notice you don't seem too fond of ChatGPT, but if you'll have me, I would like to challenge this opinion a little. I would say that for anyone who would otherwise use Google or the register of their textbook for inspiration when assessing a case, ChatGPT might be an equally worthwhile or even better way to go. As always, none of these resources should be used as a sole resource for clinical reasoning, and definitely not as a sole source for patient treatment. But they are very valuable when puzzling. Away at a case. Any facts should always be corroborated, but when taking in good common sense, precautionary measures, I think, we can all benefit highly from their existence. I hope I didn't elaborate too much or push too many buttons. Just thought it was worth mentioning.
Push the buttons. There, you pushed my button, Inga.
Well, I guess it's like Wikipedia in the olden days, you know?
So ChatGPT, the way it works is it finds a word, then links it to another and links it to another and links it to another. So and you have no idea of what's going on. Whereas if you do Google and a book and something else, you can see all the different approaches and make your own decision. And I would rather do that because chat gets it wrong a lot, right? And until it gets better, maybe for example, I just asked it. I put all the symptoms in and I said, what is it? And ChatGPT said, I'm not a doctor, but it sounds like malaria. And then I did a little more stuff, and I got what I wanted. But I'd rather look it up in Google and books and so forth, because I think doing that teaches you how to find information. Letting ChatGPT do it doesn't teach you how to find information, at least not now in its current iteration. Maybe you'll get better. By the way, Christina, could you lower your mic a little? It's just popping, okay?
That better?
Yeah, about an inch up, please.
Oh, up.
No, down. That's
Down.
good. Okay,
Okay.
thank you very much.
Okay.
All right, Daniel.
Sorry.
No problem.
All right. Sean writes, "Hi all. I am writing in from the usually sunny Okanagan Valley that is unfortunately laying under a thick blanket of smoke from the nearby wildfires. Upon hearing of something hiding in the red blood cells of our patient here, along with intermittent fever and elevated liver markers, my first thought was malaria. As far as I know, however, one's chances of contracting that while running through a park in Queens are quite low. Using the same geography to rule out trypanosomiasis leads me to a diagnosis of Babesia infection. It seems that this somewhat infrequent human parasite hangs around in the very same tick species that carry our old friend Lyme disease around the northeastern United States. My follow-up investigation would be whether or not our patient has some type of co-infection along with the Babesia, as it usually does not cause such severe disease in otherwise healthy people. Could this explain why the azithromycin and atopiquone therapy yielded no improvement? Or is it possible that there is some previously undiagnosed immunocompromising pathology in our patient? Thanks again for all you guys do educating us laymen on the world of parasites. Sean.
All right, I just asked ChatGPT, who is Dixon Despommier?
And what did it say?
They have no idea.
No, they know who you are. They know who you are, but it didn't mention you doing any podcasts. So then I asked, does Dixon Despommier do a podcast? And ChatGPT says, I don't have any information about that. I suggest you consult other sources. Okay? And so that's really bad, because it's all out there that Dixon does
That's true.
1, 2, 3 podcasts, right?
Yeah.
Dixon, you're next.
Okay, then.
Actually, I'm next, but you can go.
You are next, but you want me to go?
Vincent, you got to go. You're skipping out of your turn. Come on.
Felix writes, Dear TWiP team, greetings from Germany. I just finished my intern year and final exam, but unfortunately didn't get a position in the new infectious disease residency program over here. Well, so general internal medicine it is. I did send my last emails too late as usual, so now I try to keep it short, but in time. After toxoplasmosis and cystoisospora canis, I now suspect the third apicomplexus sighting in a row. The RBC inclusions and other lab findings are suggestive for babesiosis or malaria. Since the patient denies traveling to a malaria risk area, babesiosis would be highest on my list of parasitic differentials, even though the patient denied being bitten by a tick, but those can be sneaky. That's good. For diagnosis and a blood smear, and if still unclear, PCR could be performed. Depending on the patient's condition, supportive therapy as well as a switch to quinine and clindamycin or exchange transfusion in parasitemia bigger than 10% could be considered. I'm looking forward to the episode with the first Vienna Parasitology Passion Club. When I tried to Google it, all I found was a nightclub named with 3 of those 5 words. You can guess which. Thank you for the great monthly education with all the best. Felix. Oh, that's great. All right, now it's your turn, Dixon.
Okay, Rafid writes, Hello, TWiP team. I'm a rural internist with a very broad-based practice who has been working in a small town called Maniwaki, which is Algonquin for the land of Mary, in Quebec, about 2 hours north of the nation's capital, for the last 25 years. 4 years ago, McGill University set up a satellite medical campus in a town called Gatineau, close to my work, and was looking for French-speaking lecturers. So I volunteered to give some of the French versions of the original English Montreal McGill lectures. This gave me access to a whole catalog of the videos of the English McGill first-year medical lectures. The McGill curriculum was fantastic, and now I have a wonderful opportunity to listen to the latest developments in neurology, nephrology, immunology, etc. The best teaching block by far is the infectious disease block. The ID block is organized by the fantastic Christos Karatassos, who is a wonderful teacher, and it contains a 5-hour parasitology section that is taught by Michael Liebman, who is one of the best, funniest, and entertaining teachers I have ever run across. By the way, I'm on an aside now. I would like to nominate him for the current hero for our parasitology heroes. That's exactly the way we'd like to hear about these people. And if this guy is a great teacher and he knows his stuff, in my mind, he's a hero.
We should mention Michael's been on. He's a friend of mine.
Has he really? Well, let's make him a hero.
Yeah, he. And if people remember the story of the Frenchman with the sleeping sickness, they ask him. They say, "What is wrong with you?" And he says in French, "I have the sleeping sickness." And they say, "Yes, we know you are very sleepy."
Yeah.
So,
I just got out of a class on parasitology.
Yeah, I spent time with Michael in India, and actually, he's at ASTM&H each year. So,
wonderful! I'd like to give him a shout out then. More than a shout out, a model lecturer. So a shout out to him on the chance that he's listening.
He is a listener.
Definitely made me a much improved ID parasitology physician. So as to this case of the patient from the American Northeast who regularly jogs in a wooded area and now has a fever, hemolysis, dark urine, that's thrombocytopenia, elevated liver enzymes, and inclusion bodies in the erythrocytes. I think the most likely diagnosis is babesiosis with the parasite Babesia microti. I would be interested to know from the members of the TWiP team if this can be malaria. I teach a small group session on malaria, and the case I present to the students has exactly the same, except that the patient traveled to India instead of taking a run through Queens. However, Dr. Liebman says that in the 19th century, there was malaria during the summer in Montreal, brought over by immigrants, as well as local Anopheles mosquitoes. He also says in his lectures that there is an Anopheles in New York area, and that it is creeping north due to global warming. I also read recently that the southern United States has had some P5X malaria. Also, the basic message I am told to teach the medical students is, 1, fever in a returning traveler is malaria until proven otherwise. 2, malaria is falciparum until proven otherwise. So given his presentation and his worsening symptoms, despite appropriate anti-babesia therapy with azithromycin, would the TWiP clinicians be reaching for artemisinin? Looking forward to your opinion from a country doctor who not only has never seen a case of babesia in the frigid wilds of rural Quebec, but completely forgot about this entity the day after my ID exam in a first-year med school 30 years ago, and only remembered it after listening to Michael Liebman's lectures. Thank you all for donating your time to make this wonderful podcast possible. Cheers, Rapid.
Christina.
Christian writes, Dear TWiP, the description, including the treatment started, which is quite a spoiler, points to babesia. The dark urine is a sign of hemolysis. For Dixon, the urine looks like a dark brew of beer.
I'm not sure why that's for Dixon, right?
I was more surprised to read about the babesia carriage rate in ticks in the state of New York with up to 15%. One of my main questions would be, why is this person getting so ill? Does he have an underlying immune suppression, or is he missing his spleen? Though he's of a certain age, the patient does appear to be a best ager, being rather fit. Best wishes from London, Christian.
All right. Hakone writes, hello, based on inclusion bodies, his active lifestyle, out biking in the parks, and the recent increases in babesia incidents in the Northeast this summer, that would be my guess. It seems likely he probably picked up a tick on one of his 15-mile bike rides or 3-mile daily runs. Hey, Con. All right. Should I do another one?
Sure,
that was pretty short.
Go ahead.
All right. Era Chaley.
This one is
writes
huge.
Us, from Union County, New Jersey. Hello, TWiP. I am a Queens native who now lives in New Jersey, just down the road from Vincent. And the instant I heard this case presented, I knew there had to be a blood-sucking insect involved. I was a teenager when West Nile arrived in New York City, so perhaps I am more aware than most of the ample opportunities for people to get eaten alive out there, or perhaps even in the outer boroughs. I also recalled that in a very recent Microbe TV episode, Daniel mentioned an uptick in local babesiosis cases. So I decided to start with the assumption that this 73-year-old gentleman, who is an avid outdoor cyclist and runner in urban green spaces, was likely bitten by a tick on one of his outings. Maybe it's a bit of a leap to assume that if Daniel has something on his mind, it's worth reading about. But I decided to run with this idea, especially as he presented the case by saying he's seen several of these patients recently, and at least one of them, perhaps this one, is worth a write-up. My first destination was the New York City Department of Health's published statistics on infectious disease, so I could get a sense of what type of parasitic diseases are now endemic to my home borough. Soon, I found myself perusing a helpful little diagnostic booklet produced by the City of New York for primary care doctors that lists symptoms and suggested course of treatment for common tick-borne diseases. Within a few moments, I had 3 candidate diagnoses: the bacterium anaplasmosis, which I learned causes human disease called HDL, the bacterium ehrlichiosis, which I learned causes human disease called HME, and my original guess, the parasite Babesia microti, which is transmitted in the Northeast by the Ixodes scapularis tick. The PDF guide also gave me the following helpful information, which seemed relevant to the case. I wonder if the azithromycin atovaquone dose, which this gentleman was prescribed by his primary care doctor, was insufficient for the degree of parasitemia he was experiencing, or if this is a good case study in how and why ID doctors should be consulted as quickly as possible so they can help confirm a complete and accurate diagnosis and choose the correct therapeutic response. Furthermore, a very helpful page with references was included in the New York Department of Health PDF file and caught my eye. Now, this piqued my interest because you can tell us more about the similarities and differences between B. microti, B. ducani, and B. divergens, and the specific reproductive process of Babesia. But I'm not a doctor or even a scientist, though I did consider becoming an ENT after earning my undergraduate degree in philosophy and was proud. I also have an undergraduate degree in philosophy, so it can be done, and was proud to finish my pre-med requirements as a post-bac at Columbia University. I work in finance as a data taxonomist and modeler. So parasites, the kind that make you sick, are well outside my wheelhouse. And this is the first guest I've felt encouraged to send in to you. I hope I've done it correctly. Please continue the amazing work. TWiP is the highlight of my podcast reel whenever a new episode drops, as your enthusiasm for the subject is, yes, contagious.
So it's so funny. A philosophy major wanted to become an ENT. I think that's interesting. And also a data taxonomist. I get this picture of taking data and stuffing it into deer heads on the wall. You know? Well, thank you.
I think, yeah. Okay.
Ayal writes, Dear Vincent and the sages of the microscopic eukaryotes, greetings from Sydney and the land down under. Just for the record, I've won a book, but I believe it was not shipped yet. My guess for this episode is malaria. Ooh, more specifically, I would guess it is Plasmodium falciparum based on severity of the infection. All the clues Dr. Griffin has given screamed malaria. RBC inclusions. Malaria would cause RBC damage, anemia, and thrombocytopenia due to the RBC damage and inflammation. Bilirubin, RBC damage, ALT, liver damage due to the malaria parasites in the liver. Intermittent fever, chills, dark urine, malaria. After consulting Dr. Google, I think I understand why our patient wasn't improving after being treated with azithromycin and atovaquone. Azithromycin doesn't treat the parasite itself, and atovaquone should actually be given together with proguanil under the label Malarone. So my ignorant recommendation would be to continue treating with Malarone, as the patient is definitely tolerant to atovaquone already. Certainly looks like the endogenous spread of malaria is picking up in the U.S. and elsewhere. Who knows? Maybe tonic water is the next big thing. I find it interesting, exciting, and depressing all at the same time, mostly depressing. Keep up all that you do. The world needs more saints like you. Thank you, Eyal. Wow. Okay, back to the top. Dixon.
Michelle and Alexander from the First Vienna Parasitology Passion Club writes, Dear Babisi Bros, what walks like Plasmodium, quacks like Plasmodium, but isn't Plasmodium? Answer, Babesia. Regarding the case of a 73-year-old, otherwise healthy male without significant travel history, who presented to the ED with fever and progressive weakness for 2 weeks, our guess is that this patient is infected with Babesia microti. Babesia is a tick-borne parasite of the Apicomplexa phylum, which most commonly presents with flu-like symptoms, fever, and hemolytic anemia. Though immunocompetent patients with babesiosis are oftentimes asymptomatic. It can be differentiated from anaplasmosis via detection of hemolysis and from malaria via travel history, antigen testing, blood smears, and, if doubt remains, via a polymerase chain reaction. Like during infections with Plasmodium species, inclusion bodies are often seen on blood smears, which can mimic those found in malaria. A more specific finding is the tetrad Maltese cross formation. The first-line treatment for babesiosis is azithromycin in combination with atovaquone, which is preferred over the combination of clindamycin and quinine, which cause more severe side effects, but are used in severe or refractory cases. Rarely exchange transfusions are necessary. Preventive measures included using insect repellents, wearing long-sleeved clothing, and performing tick checks after being outdoors. Thank you for this great case. All the best, Michelle and Alexander from the First Vienna Parasitology Passion Club. I love it. I love it. I love it.
Christina.
Natalia writes, Dear TWiPers, while this patient's symptoms are relatively non-specific, the chronicity of fever and his lab work raise concern for babesiosis from Babesia microti. Given that he lives in the northeast and frequently runs in parks, he could have been exposed to this parasite via a bite from Ixodes scapularis tick in the recent warm weather month. Initial testing includes a peripheral blood smear, which can sometimes show the merozoites in a tetrad orientation, the Maltese cross, if there is a high level of parasitemia. Babesia PCR and species-specific serology testing should be sent as well. While oral atovaquone and azithromycin are the appropriate therapy for most cases, he would likely require escalation to quinine and IV clindamycin for a 7 to 10 day course. Depending on his level of parasitemia, he may warrant exchange transfusion. With this acute presentation and the risk of co-transmission from Ixodes scapularis, he would have co-infection. He could have co-infection with Borrelia burgdorferi and or Anaplasma phagocytophilium. Depending on his clinical course, his team could consider an empiric doxycycline course. Thank you for all that you do.
Daniel.
All right. Jeremy writes, hello, TWiPeteers. This sounds like babesiosis. RBC inclusions, merozoites, show up as rings and crosses on peripheral smear. Anemia and thrombocytopenia. Dark urine from hemolytic anemia. Treatment is atovaquone and azithromycin. I'm not sure about anaplasma prevalence in New York, but here in southern Vermont, I would draw for anaplasma PCR and add empiric treatment with doxycycline until this resulted. I know that empiric treatment can curl bow ties, but there are times when the benefit far outweighs the risk. I would continue to monitor platelets as patients can develop ITP, that's idiopathic thrombotic thrombocytopenia, purpura, secondary to babesiosis. If he still felt CRA-PPY after the resolution of the babesiosis, I would consider Lyme antibodies. Denies tick bites is a bit like an ESR. in that it's more useful in the negative than the positive. Ixodes nymphs are about the size of a poppy seed and easily missed. Unless he were really looking and had an amazing mirror attachment, there's a good chance our patient might have missed an attached tick. If he has no intimate partner, I would bring him in for a full body tick check. This could also be a good opportunity to make the more intimate acquaintance of someone he might have admired from afar. Look, I know this probably seems like a weird thing to ask, but my doctor says I need someone to check me all over for ticks. I could have you dinner in return, maybe. Every cloud. Jeremy Morrison.
That's funny. That's very funny. That's a good line,
I'm not sure it's a good line, Vincent.
You don't think you could just walk up to someone in a bar and say, I need a whole body chick check?
No.
You could do that in a bar, but not for a doctor. I think that's crossing the line between doctor-patient relationships.
They would give you a whole body check if you asked them that, right?
You could ask a policeman.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe a policeman
That'll
would be the
work.
right person.
All right, one more from Kyle.
Just strip search.
Greetings, esteemed. No, wait, this is Christina. Christina, it's your turn. No, it's my turn. Boy, I'm so confused today.
Isn't it Vincent's turn? Like I just went.
Yeah, it's
and
my
now
turn.
I think it's Vincent.
Kylie writes, greeting esteemed TWiPers. I'm an avid fan of all things microbe TV, and as a science educator, I would like to thank you for continuing to educate me on the wonderful world of microbiology. For our case study, my first inclination was malarial infection, though a case of malaria in a New Yorker who hasn't left the comfortable confines of the Big Apple was a difficult pill to swallow. We had a case of malaria in a New Yorker, right, Daniel?
Yes. But, most of the cases in New Yorkers tend to be imports. They tend to go somewhere else and come back, where nowadays you can just hang out in sunny Florida and you can get dengue, you can get malaria, you can get leprosy. I'm not moving to Florida.
We had a New Yorker penguin get malaria.
We did. And that New Yorker penguin didn't even travel.
That's right. Okay, the mentioning of erythrocyte inclusions accompanied by anemia on top of the described symptoms of fever and lethargy would have been a slam dunk if not for the lack of a travel history. Indeed, I decided to do a Google search of malarial cases in New York, which took me to the New York State Department of Health's website. Here it said that malarial infections are most commonly associated with traveling to foreign countries, but there have been rare cases of local transmission in Long Island and New York City. Case closed? I didn't think it could be that easy, so I decided to look into the second clue provided by Dr. Griffin, which was that the patient was treated with azithromycin and atovaquone. I'm familiar with azithromycin, as I'm currently working on a graduate certificate in medical microbiology, but atovaquone was new to me. I plugged the two medications into a Google search, and the first hit that mentioned the two together came from an article published in the New England Journal of Medicine. You see, that's how it's done. You put two hits together in Google and you figure it out on your own using your own brain. Good job. What is this, Kyle? Good job. This article describes the use of azithromycin and atovaquone as treatment for babesiosis. Tragically, I was not able to consort with the great authoritative book on parasitic diseases. I think you know which one I'm referring to because I don't own a copy. It's online for free. You can search
You can download it for
PDF.
free.
Abandoning any temptation to consort with ChatGPT, unlike some of my students in some lecture assignments, I decided to dig a little deeper into babesiosis, and lo, it is transmitted by a tick bite. I suppose our patient was unaware of the filthy bloodsucker that was most likely hiding in his hair or darker nether regions where one doesn't often scan for potential ectoparasites. According to the CDC, babesiosis in the Northeast is most likely associated with Babesia microti, where it's transmitted through the bite of the tick Ixodes scapularis. The little parasites like to take up residence in the red blood cells, hence the RBC inclusions, and can cause a variety of symptoms, including fever, lethargy, dark urine, hemolytic anemia, thrombocytopenia, splenomegaly, and hepatomegaly. Considering all of this, my diagnosis for our patient is that he has babesiosis from a tick bite that he probably picked up from one of his excursions through the park. Now it feels like a slam dunk. Most common treatment, no surprise, azithromycin and atovaquone, and he gives the CDC recommended treatment. I was talking about TWiP with a fellow faculty member several months ago, specifically the case studies. He is a veterinarian by training, and we both teach anatomy and physiology. So I thought he would find your podcast most interesting and informative. I wish more science podcasts were this engaging with their listeners, as this one assuredly is. Thank you all for everything that you do, Kyle. So speaking of ChatGPT, since we haven't mentioned it today, I just want to say we got an email from our course director at Columbia saying any question we make up for our course, we have to put it into ChatGPT to make sure it cannot answer it.
What?
Right? Because if ChatGPT can answer it, then the students are going to use ChatGPT to get the right answers.
Oh, can't answer it accurately, I guess.
Yeah, so
because it'll answer. It'll say something.
Oh, it'll say crap. Yeah, if it says crap, I'm sorry. My records only go to 2021. Stuff like that. All right, that's our guesses. Pretty good.
Actually, quite good. So a few more guesses, I guess. So Christina, who is struggling with a bout of the mild form of COVID, right?
Yes. Thankfully, I had a vaccine, so I'm not majorly affected.
Well, that is what makes it mild, as we like to point out.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't really want to imagine what it would be like without the vaccine. So, what was I meant to do?
Oh, you're going to
the
guess.
diagnosis.
Yeah, so that's the brain fog. It's beginning.
It's probably been affecting my brain a little bit. Well, I was thinking babesiosis. I didn't even consider malaria just because it's in New York. And actually, I was thinking we don't really have babesiosis in humans in the UK at all. It's quite interesting. Although we do have some cases in dogs, particularly imported dogs from Eastern Europe. So maybe we're going to have zoonotic babesiosis at some point soon. Although I don't think that's Babesia microti. I'm not 100% sure. So yeah, babesiosis is my guess. Sorry, a bit rambly.
No. So before Vincent and Dixon go, I should ask. So it's been suggested that it's babesiosis. Now, there has never ever been an autochthonous documented babesiosis case in the borough of Queens. So, as I mentioned, is this it? Is this the first description of an autochthonous babesiosis case in Queens? What do you think, Dixon?
I do. I think this might be very well falling into that category. I also agree with most everybody's diagnosis of babesiosis. But if I could get a look at the slide, of course, then it would be definitive, I think, because I've seen a lot of it on the slides, but I have never encountered one after I was a medical technician at Columbia. And I looked at a lot of blood smears just for practice because I was taking another course called clinical medicine, which was a very interesting course, by the way. I never saw another one after that. I never even heard of another one. So hearing about this for the first time is a bit of a surprise, but not shocking. The ticks are everywhere. So 50% of the ticks in Westchester County are positive for Lyme disease, just to give you an idea about the spread of certain parasites. And I think you might want to write this one up for the JAMA and say, guess what?
Dixon,
it's here.
Dixon, the ticks are not positive for Lyme disease.
Sorry?
The ticks are not positive.
No, they don't have the disease. No, they don't have the disease.
What do they have,
have the
Dixon?
vector.
What do they have?
The vector.
Yes.
They're the vector.
Yeah. So we need to be precise
right.
in our speaking here.
I take it all back. I've been on vacation.
I know,
My mind's a little loose.
It's okay. It's okay.
Daniel. Sorry,
Yes.
Daniel, did not someone say in one of the letters that Babesia microti is endemic in New York City?
So it has been described in every other borough, but it's never been described as acquired in Queens, unless this is the first case.
Well, Daniel, parts of Queens are on the border of Long Island, right? So
it is funny. True. I live in Long Island, but I'm 4 miles from the border, so it is sort of a.
It's an artificial boundary, right? So if he lives near the the boundary.
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah,
fine.
yeah. And
I've
who
actually
knows
highlighted my
how
ignorance of the geography
may
of
have
New York.
Yeah,
may
no,
have
it
jogged
is
out of
funny.
Queens.
There's a couple of the boroughs, Brooklyn and Queens, are really Western Long Island. So my
That's
parents who pride themselves on being from Brooklyn, I always say, "Oh yeah, you living on Long Island? You were born in Western Long Island? Oh, Brooklyn." I'm like, that's pretty much Western Long Island the way I'm looking at a map.
It's true. It's all one big island. Yep.
Truly.
So okay, so Vincent, you went with Babesia as well.
Yeah, initially I considered malaria because some of the symptoms, right? The hemolytic anemia, thrombocytopenia, etc. But there isn't. Malaria is pretty rare here, so I think Babesia and you said no tick bite, so I thought that was a good clue. Right.
All right. So that's what it was, right? And actually going into this, the diagnosis was made by the primary care doctor. We really are seeing a lot of Babesia cases. And so just a little bit about it. So yeah, it does present very similar to malaria, right? It presents with just this fever, headache, incredible debility. I mean, you can go from being an athletic individual to being in a wheelchair. The cutoff, I guess, in a sense, you could say for people in endemic areas with percent parasitemia is a little bit different. So with malaria, it's 10%. With Babesia, the cutoff is 4%. So this gentleman had more than 4% parasitemia. And that's probably important for our listeners to hear because this person had more than 4% parasitemia. So you should sort of recognize that that's severe and maybe not something you're going to weather at home. That might be something where you need the supportive care of being in a facility. As far as treatment, I like the fact that the person referenced the New England Journal of Medicine article, atovaquone and azithromycin for treatment of babesiosis, which was actually a head-to-head. They're looking at how do you treat this? Do you treat it with atovaquone azithro, or do you, quote unquote, as they like to say, escalate to clindamycin quinine? And the nice thing about that, quinidine.
Didn't they also mention quinidine?
No, it's actually quinine that you're using. So it's a clindamycin quinine. And interesting enough, this was a prospective, non-blind, randomized trial. And you compare the two, you get the same outcomes, but you get less toxicity sticking with the atovaquone azithromycin. So it's really not escalating, actually. So you do want to stick with your effective, least toxic therapy. And what you do is you actually can follow daily parasitemia just like you would with malaria. So this gentleman came in with greater than 4%. As they were treated, the parasitemia dropped to 3%, dropped down. The other thing is looking for co-infections. And this is an interesting comment because azithromycin is effective against the Borrelia, against Lyme disease. So, I've got a patient in the hospital right now who, interesting enough, came in over the weekend when I was, busy on call with a, 4% parasitemia for Babesia, so different person. Also had Lyme IgM positive, Lyme PCR positive, also EBV IgM positive and EBV DNA in the thousands, so sort of a multiple infection. And that person we have on doxycycline as well, but and their parasitemia is less than 1%, but they're still having fevers. And I think that's another thing to comment about. You want to follow the parasitemia because these individuals can have a prolonged course. So this 7 to 10 days is more of a guidance because some individuals, for whatever reason, may require longer therapy. And then some people may even relapse. So I think that's important stuff. The other, which, those pearls, there's always these pearls where people mention the Maltese cross. Mm-hmm. I do want to mention only about 10 or 15% of cases have the Maltese cross. So you're usually not going to see it. So 85% of the time, you're not going to see it. So seeing it is great. And it has to do with this tetrad replicative phenomenon. But not seeing it doesn't rule it out.
Okay. Great.
And yes, and the exchange transfusion, which Vincent asked about, that's, there's a limited amount of evidence for benefit there, right? So that's, greater than 10%, we start thinking about that. There's some case reports, there's a limited series, maybe there's some benefit to exchange transfusion. But one of the things, and this is always something that comes up with malaria, don't forget to actually treat. Don't be like so focused on, getting your exchange transfusion arranged that you forget to start in this case, anti-babesia medicines, or so many times with malaria, get the malaria medicine started.
How did he turn out, Daniel?
So he did quite well. His primary care, the hematologists that got involved were quite concerned. I was getting daily calls for updates. Did quite well. Spent a few days in the hospital. Made a full recovery.
You should have told him that he did have a tick bite, and he should have gone to found someone to give him a whole body tick exam.
I did introduce him to one of my favorite country songs, where they check each other for ticks. So one of our emailers may know that.
There's a song about that?
There's a song.
Had not known.
All right, it's time to give away a book.
Okay.
We had 15 guesses, so let's pick a random number between 1 and 15. Dixon, do you have a drum roll?
I do.
Number 3.
Ta-da!
Number 3 is Paul. Paul,
Yay.
who learned a lot. There you go, Paul. So send your address to TWiP@microbe.tv. And if you are outside of the U.S., include your phone number. We need that for shipping. I promise I won't call you. I won't. All right. It is time. We have 2 papers for you, both about malaria vaccines, both different approaches. So we thought we would do both. And Christina has one. I have the other. So Christina, why don't you start with yours?
Okay, I will do that. So the paper that I've chosen is titled Malaria Transmission Blocking Vaccine, PFS 230D1 EPA and PFS 25 EPA in Al-Hydrogel in healthy Malian adults, a phase 1 randomized control trial. And if I can just bring it up on my screen, this was published in the Lancet Infectious Diseases in July 2023. We have 2 joint first author, which are Isaka Sagara and Sarah Healy, and the corresponding author is Patrick Duffy. And this paper has been written in collaboration by many co-authors from various different centers, some of these in Mali and others in, let me just check, in Rockville, USA, and several other places as well. So,
actually, Elise M. O'Connell, a friend of mine, is on there.
Very good.
It was nice to see some of your friends on there.
Now I'm feeling more pressure.
And I'm trying to figure out how they decided the order of the co-first authors. I don't know if you've been following
I have
a
on
recent
Twitter.
publication where I think, what did they do? Play Super Mario Brothers?
Yes, Super Smash Brothers. Yeah, I guess, I suppose maybe just toss a coin or play Super Smash Brothers. I wouldn't do too well on that. Okay, so we have in the past talked about malaria vaccines that, just trying to remember the names of it. Sorry, my brain is slightly addled and my scrolling thing is moving without me doing anything. So we already have, so in 2021, the WHO has already recommended an anti-parasite vaccine for malaria in children, RTS-AS1, and that reduces clinical malaria and malaria death, particularly in children younger than 5. And there is another candidate vaccine also has shown efficacy in field trials, and that also targets the pre-erythrocytic parasites, just like the vaccine already in use. So this vaccine here that we're talking about is really quite different. So it's a malaria transmission blocking vaccine. And really what that means, so this is not a vaccine that will stop clinical disease, but it can block the onward transmission. So the parasite that is targeted by this vaccine is, so the parasite stage that is targeted is the gametocytes and the gametes and the zygotes. So the gametocytes are the life cycle stage that are going to be taken up by the mosquito during a blood meal, and then they undergo sexual replication, and then they develop further until eventually you produce more infectious parasites. So these transmission blocking vaccines, they would be blocking this process. So and potentially they could maybe be used together with other methods to reduce or to eliminate malaria in malaria endemic regions. But we're not there yet, so we're really just at the very initial stages. So this particular one was a phase 1 study. So I think the primary endpoints was really for that paper was to check whether the vaccine is safe, whether it induces an immune response, and then in a secondary endpoint was to look at whether that vaccine could also block transmission. So we're looking at 2 of these antigens that we find on the gametocytes. So one of them PFS230, which is a gamete surface protein, and PFS25, which is a zygote and eukinase surface protein. So these were expressed in yeast, and they were conjugated to a protein, and also an adjuvant was used, which is alhydrogel, and I think that's quite a widely used. What word did I just use? Adjuvant. So in this randomized control trial, there were really 2 trials in one. So one of them was a pilot. So altogether they had, and I'm just going to scroll down here to figure 1. And I'm not sure if this is an open access paper, but you can actually, in the paper, there's a kind of a flow chart of what they did. So all in all, they recruited 225 participants, and 25 of those they randomly assigned to a pilot safety cohort, which is really a repeat of a study that they already did in New York, but this time the study was done in Mali. But I think I'm just going to focus on the main trial here. So what they did, they split the group of 200 into 4 groups. So 50 of those, they received the PFS25 antigen vaccine. 50 received the PFS230 vaccine. Another 50 got a combination of both. And the final 50, they were on a control vaccine. I suppose not. Control is maybe not the right word to use. Comparator vaccine, and that was Twinrix, which I think is a hepatitis A and B combined vaccine.
It is, yeah.
And so that was for the first 3 injections, and the 4th was a vaccine against meningococcal meningitis.
Yeah, Menactra.
Yeah. So and I suppose I've already implied that this was a 4 vaccination course that they do. And if you kind of go down that diagram, we can see that at the end of the study, really quite a large proportion of the participants had completed So 41, 39, 37, and 39 in the respective group. So, I mean, there's some dropout, but not that much. So the way that the trial is, so they were given the vaccination, and I can't now at the top of my head remember how they were spaced. I don't know if anyone else can, but...
Yeah, so they do a first dose on day 0, and you're going to get either the PFS 25, the PFS 230D, or you're going to get a combo, or you're going to get a comparator, and you're going to get that day 0, day 28, day 168, that's a little bit random, and then, are you ready for this, day 540.
Okay, so that's essentially a year and a half later or more, 18 months or thereabouts. So yeah, that's really quite a long trial if we think about that. So the patients, they were monitored for adverse effects just immediately after the vaccination, then on days 1, 3, 7, 14, and 28, and then monthly until the completion of the trial. They did also blood smears before vaccination and at least monthly after vaccination, and twice per week. They had a direct, what does DSF stand for? I did note it down.
And they actually, I mean, what's impressive is we've got data out to day 730. I mean, so they're following these people for a couple of years.
Yeah, and actually, that's why I pointed out that we have quite good, not all that much dropout considering how much they really had to do. Yeah. I'm just trying to find what DSF direct something feeding. So they were not only those participants did not only have to...
Direct skin feeding assays.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so they were not only taken blood to do blood smears, but they actually were also used as food for mosquitoes. So, that's quite a commitment, really, for the trial participants. So, and they collected samples at various time points to check immunogenicity. And they also checked whether they did a functional activity assays, where they were checking whether the vaccine would actually block transmission. And so I think it might be time to talk about some results now. I have some issues with my PDF.
I could jump in a little. So we have, let's see, well, this is figure 2, where we've got, basically you can ask at the 4 different groups, and you can see how much IgG response do you get to PFS 25, and in part B, you get how much response to PFS 230 D1. And I mean, at the end of the day, we're going to be much more interested in the response to the PFS 230 D1. And the interesting thing here is if you give the PFS 230 D1 all by itself, you get the best response to the PFS 230 D1. When you add it, when you give it and the PFS 25 at the same time, and you're actually giving the full 40 micrograms, plus you're giving a 47 microgram of the PFS 25, you actually get lower resultant IgG responses to the PFS 230 D1. So, the whole idea of we'll throw a bunch of stuff together, it actually looks like if the 230 D1 is the one you're after, if that's going to be your best response, you're better off giving it as a monovalent formulation.
Yeah, and the PFS 25 really didn't really show any difference to the comparator vaccines.
Yeah. And guess what? When you give Twinrix and Menactra, you don't get a antibody response against malaria. Imagine that.
I suppose, that's always good to know as well.
Yeah, but they didn't do just a normal saline placebo, so I just don't know what to do with this data, Vincent.
Indeed. We'll have to ask RFK Jr.
He would not approve of this trial.
So what was the next thing that they did? I think they did, so when they did functionality assays to determine whether so obviously transmission blocking is something that is really quite challenging to observe in the field unless you have absolutely massive numbers of participants, which they did not. So they were trying to kind of replicate that in vitro, and they were trying to assess whether the antibodies produced would be able to block transmission in mosquitoes. And the way they did that is they would can't remember. Sorry.
Yeah, they did this feeding assay.
Yes. Yeah. Where is that
so
figure?
It's a standard membrane feeding assay.
Yeah. So they fed the mosquitoes on the patients.
In two areas, because I was like, why are they feeding them to the calves? I'm like, oh no, the patient's calves. Like not the ones owned by them, but the ones that are down there in the bottom part of their legs. They're letting them bite people, actually. So
yeah, so they did. So and then they did the blood-fed mosquitoes. They would take away and they would incubate them for a week, and then they were dissecting them and counting oocysts, oocysts. And actually, what they found, and I think that is figure 3.
Yeah, you get figure 3. You get all the transmission reducing
you get all the transmissions.
Data.
So really, there's a lot of data in there, but I really think that the main focus, if you do have the paper, should probably be on D and F figures. No, C and F. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So they were really showing the data 10 weeks after the 4th dose. So that's, almost 2 years into the trial. And they could actually see a significant reduction of transmission for the PFS 230 vaccine in these data. Okay.
Yeah, I guess we're going to get into the next paper, but I was a little disappointed. So they're sort of assuming that this is all antibody mediated, and maybe they're right, because we've got all this transmission reducing activity relative to, antibody titers.
So if we maybe then come to, so they did actually also analyze blood-fed mosquitoes. They did also analyze infection in the patients, and that is, I'm still having issues with my PDF. Something really odd has happened.
Figure 4, they do these the direct skin feeding assay results for all the participants who transmitted at least one, so 175 individuals. But I think in brief, or it's sort of, I don't know if you're ready to sum, it looks like, as far as the phase 1, it looks safe. There is some immunogenicity data, which is reasonably compelling.
Yep.
And I like the idea, right? Because we sort of talked about what a high bar it is to try to take out the sporozoites, in those just few minutes pre-hepatic life cycle, and how we probably have to keep pretty high antibody levels to ever be able to block that level. And this is in a sense the altruistic vaccine, right? This is it's not going to help you individually, but it is going to help your community. I mean, it might help you because then it's not going to come back to reinfect, because sometimes, you're participating in the cycle that ends up with you getting infected that next season. But yeah, I like the commentary where they say, this is going to be a hard sell. We want to give you a vaccine that helps everybody else. The altruistic, because I hate to say this, but over the last few years, I have really come to learn that most people care much more about themselves than other people.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a bit dependent on where in the world people are.
Surprise. Well, I wanted to draw your attention to reference number 7, who happens to be Robert Gwad's. He's one of the co-authors on our textbook. And he did the first experiments on this concept back in 1976.
Wow.
And it
Well,
shows
that's
you
quite some
how
time
little
there.
progress has been made since then. And
Yeah.
with the same results, except in this case, they're looking at a human form of malaria. In this case, Bob Gwad's used Plasmodium gallinaceum in
Yeah.
birds and could do the transmission study on the birds to show that the parasites were not transmitted to the birds when he used certain forms of the sexual stages of the parasite. And
Wow.
that result has languished in the laboratory for that long, and for the reason that you pointed out, Daniel, and that is that we're much more interested in ourselves than our neighbors, but realizing that, of course, if the neighbor catches malaria, eventually your chances of catching malaria will also be high. So don't consider them something apart from your own personal world, because we're all part of the same ecosystem.
Yeah.
I think a main limitation maybe of this trial was that it didn't really have enough statistical power to see a reduction in transmission, which I think really would be a next step. But I think now that we know that this is safe, and in vitro we do have transmission reduction, so I think this might be maybe more achievable in a next phase trial. Although reading, I think they did 3,850 direct skin feed assays in those 225 or 200 participants. So I think if you were to, you have to increase the numbers for a follow-up trial. I'm not sure how manageable that really would be in terms of, workload. And
I'm curious
so you
as
probably
to
had to rethink really how you would set up a next phase trial to make it more efficient, maybe.
I have a question for you, Christina. What was the percentage reduction in mosquito production of O-kinates?
I think it was around 20%. I think that was in figure.
20.
Maybe less.
Not as much as you would hope.
Not as much as you'd hope.
That's still not going to prevent them from transmitting malaria. It's just not going to work like that.
Yeah, no, it wasn't huge numbers.
You need an antigen that reduces it to zero.
So,
and if you could have a zero in mosquitoes, that's the first step to going into people. I think they went into people far too soon.
I think I may have gotten the numbers wrong, Dixon. So it says here significant transmission reducing activity appeared for PFS 230 and PFS 25 after the third dose, with a mean of 74.5% and 68.6%. And after the fourth dose, 88.9% and 85%.
It's still not enough, unfortunately. Those sound like good numbers, and I agree with you that I would try to sell that to a granting agency to continue the work. But when you've got 15% left and almost cysts in the stomach of the mosquito, then they're still producing sporozoites, and all you need is one to complete the infection.
I guess, but maybe in combination with other methods.
No, I understand.
For example, in other vaccines.
I'm not as pessimistic. I think if you can reduce transmission by 80%, which is, because they do make a comment, is that really a good, sort of, there's the binary, are they getting transmission at all? And if you reduce that by 80%, then you can start counting what's in the 20% that do transmit. But if you reduce transmission by 80%, just think about, we always talk about how is it impossible that malaria is transmitted, right? Because you need that 1% of double biting females. And so, I mean, if you can, and I do think, I don't think this will be a monovalent delivered vaccine once we get past the trials, but used in combination with other vaccines. If you can protect the person and block onward transmission, the effects could be additive.
Mm-hmm. And then obviously you'd also have other methods of prevention, like the bed nets and indoor residual spraying and larval control, etc.
And maybe some T-cell vaccines that target the liver stage. Should we move on to that?
About that. So we have, just to clarify, we're talking about three different kinds of malaria vaccines. The kinds that target either the sporozoites, so the mosquitoes release sporozoites into you. Sporozoites infect liver cells, then merozoites are released, so then you have more blood forms. Merozoites infect red blood cells. So
Right.
two blood stages, sporozoites and merozoites, targeted by different vaccines. And RTSS is targeting the sporozoites. Doesn't work so well because you have a short window, right? But then we have a third class of vaccines that would target the infected liver cells, the infected hepatocytes. And there you need vaccines that induce CD8 T cells. And that's what this paper is about. It's in Nature Immunology, mRNA vaccine against malaria tailored for liver-resident memory T cells. Two first authors, Mitch Ganley and Lauren Holtz. Three corresponding authors, Gavin Painter, Ian Hermans, and William Heath. They are from a variety of institutions in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. And so when we talk about T cells, there are a lot of different kinds of CD8 T cells, but the ones that are important for eliminating infected cells in the liver are called tissue-resident memory cells because they're in the tissue that well, in this case, the liver. They're not the blood forms. The blood forms are different. They are tissue effector memory cells, which are in the blood, and central memory cells. You can induce those, but if you don't induce tissue-resident memory T cells, it's going to be a problem. So that's what they look at in this paper. And as the title says, they're using an mRNA vaccine. So the first experiment they do is simply to take a model antigen, chicken ovalbumin, and they take the mRNA encoding that, complex it in liposomes, make an mRNA vaccine. They vaccinate mice intravenously, which in mice favors the induction of these T cells. And they show that this immunization does induce circulating T cells, the T effector memory and the T central memory, but very few tissue-resident memory cells, T cells in the liver. So what they do is they add an adjuvant. They add a fluorescent derivative of alpha-glucoceramide called BODIP alpha GC or alpha GCB, and boom, you get tremendous induction of tissue-resident memory T cells in the liver, and if they then immunize mice with with P. burgeri sporozoites that produce ovalbumin, right? So they've immunized these mice against ovalbumin by itself. Now they have made a transgenic malaria that makes ovalbumin on the sporozoites. All the mice are protected from the development of the blood stage, which happens after the liver. Single dose of mRNA vaccine. So that is a model experiment which shows that their strategy might work. Now, what they do explore this adjuvant a little because alpha GC doesn't work as well as alpha GC BODIP, which is chemically different, and they seem to be unhappy about that. So they do experiments that address that. But what I think is a really interesting experiment, they take mice lacking type 1 NK T cells, which are a kind of innate natural killer T cell, and they show that the mice, you need those NK T cells to make these efficient T resident memory T cell responses. So that's a little mechanistic information there. Okay, so all these experiments have been done with mice that have been given ovalbumin-specific T cells by adoptive transfer to help them track the T cells. But now they want to know, can we do this without adding T cells to these mice? So they just take C57 black mice and they vaccinate them with the ovalbumin mRNA alone, with or without the adjuvant. And again, they show the induction of tissue-resident memory cells in the liver. And again, much better when they use the alpha GCB adjuvanted mRNA vaccine. And then they can also give a second dose to boost the mice, and they get an increase in the ova-specific tissue-resident memory cells in the liver as well. So one dose works, but you can also boost and get a significant induction. Okay, so what about malaria? Let's use some malaria antigens. So they make a new mRNA vaccine encoding the large ribosomal subunit protein of P. burgii. So it's a ribosomal subunit protein which is presumed to have lots of T cell epitopes in it. They vaccinate mice with that mRNA vaccine with or without the adjuvant, and they show with the alpha GCB adjuvant great induction of TRM cells in the liver, tissue-resident memory T cells in the liver directed against the ribosomal, one of the ribosomal T cell epitopes. All right, so that's nice, but are they protected? So they then infect mice with sporozoites, and they're assessed for the onset of the blood stage after the liver. 80% of mice that were vaccinated have no parasitemia, and thus they're sterilely protected.
Yeah, they use that word sterilizing.
Sterilizing protection, which doesn't mean they can't reproduce. Right? Unfortunately, it's being used in that sense, right? But if they don't have this agonist, this adjuvant included, they don't get good protection. So it's interesting that you do need that to get high levels of these tissue-resident.
So, Vincent, I'd like to head off of Jen's email to us.
Yes.
You mentioned that when you injected the parasites into the mice, you infected them, but only 20% became infected. The other 80% did not become infected.
Yeah.
So they were all injected.
They were all injected.
20.
I agree, but the paper actually says infected. So
well, they are wrong.
Yeah, you're right. That's fine. I agree. They injected them, right? Or inoculated, right? That would be another.
Inoculated would have been a better word.
Yeah,
that's right.
Totally agree. They do some other experiments to show that you can increase these malaria-specific T cells by boosting. They show that it's the CD8 cells that are important, not CD4 T cells, not NK T cells or NK cells. They do some nice experiments depleting each of those. They also show that if you've had a previous infection, a previous parasitemia in mice, it does not impair the ability of this vaccine to induce effective T cell immunity. That's been shown to be an issue with other vaccines, but it doesn't seem to be an issue with this one. So this is obviously it's a preclinical study. There are no people involved except the ones doing the experiments. But in mice anyway, giving a ribosomal protein as an mRNA vaccine with an adjuvant favors the induction of and these, by the way, these adjuvants are actually NK T cell agonists. They stimulate those cells, and they're, as we showed, if we deplete those cells, those are important for the generation of T resident memory cells in the liver, and one dose is sufficient to do that. They worry that this adjuvant, they say, although our approach is highly efficacious, it adds a level of complexity of translation, right? You have to add this agonist to it, so that obviously has to be explored in humans, right? So this is a different kind of vaccine to target those infected liver cells. So they no longer release the merozoites, and they say maybe this could be useful. So what do you think, folks? Do you like this approach?
Sounds good. Sounds very good, actually.
Of course, it doesn't mean it's going to work in people, right? But
correct.
I like it a lot. I think maybe I was, for our listeners who don't have the malaria life cycle, at the tip of their tongue at all times, right? So we've talked about this challenge. So the mosquito probes around, inserts that proboscis, and then introduces the sporozoites. And the idea that we're going to, target and we're going to keep antibodies at a high enough level that we're going to neutralize all those sporozoites pre-liver stage. Seems like a high bar. I mean, how often are we going to have to be vaccinating people? And then once we do it, are we going to have any kind of pressure that there'll be mutation away from that? But I like this idea. T cells, and they talk a little bit about this. You can put so much information in there. You can educate the T cells for everybody with all the different HLA types that during those 3-4 days, when there's a liver stage, potentially if you can prevent the blood stage, you don't even have to worry about the gametocytes.
Yeah.
Because you're not, I mean, that when you get sick when you have the erythrocytic part of the life cycle, right? So sporozoites, 3 to 4 days in the liver, and then you have your erythrocytic stage, and that's when people get fevers and they feel sick, and eventually the gametocytes form. So I like this. I like it as a, potentially more durable. You got 3 to 4 days. That's plenty of time for the T cell response, plenty of time for the T resident memory cells to respond. So I think that this is really promising.
Yeah, I like it a lot. Yep.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, it's obviously a different approach, and it's using mRNA vaccination, which we know can be very effective, right? So, I mean, clearly the pandemic has led to people being more interested in mRNA vaccines, and this is the outcome of one of those. I think it's really good.
Yep.
Just to be clear, the antigen was the entire surface antigen from the sporozoite. Is that correct?
No, it's a ribosomal RNA protein.
No, of what?
It's a Plasmodium ribosome. So it's not a surface, because remember, these are T cell responses. So they're going to be, they're going to be presenting the peptides and the MHC.
Okay.
And I think, but this is great that you bring this up, because I think this is the key thing. And this is the advantage of maybe mRNA vaccines, is you can really pack a lot of T cell epitopes into an mRNA vaccine delivery.
So apparently, Dixon, the liver cells that are infected are displaying T cell epitopes from the ribosomal proteins.
Right. No, a good deal.
It's amazing, but they just display everything, and so and a ribosomal protein is rather large, so it's a good target.
Right.
It's cool. Very smart. Good job.
I think we'll hear a lot more about that in the coming years.
I think so. Yep. All right. Do we have a hero, Dixon?
We do. I've already listed it.
Michael.
But our listeners can't read the show notes.
You got to tell us.
I already said it.
No excuse. You got to say it again. You got to tell me all about him, right? Did you research him?
I don't know anything about him, but
I know everything about Michael. Well, not everything, but I should say. So
I shouldn't be the only one talking about this.
Michael is definitely a superstar. So he's up at McGill with some other friends of mine, and I first met Michael in southern India. And he is a fantastic, well-versed, very knowledgeable parasitologist. But beyond that, he's a great educator. He's one of those people, like, you remember his teaching. I remember one of his slides where he puts it up and he says, okay, fever. Let's talk about what we mean by fever. And then he shows different, he shows the Bieber fever, which is Justin Bieber fever, which probably is a big thing. And, beaver fever, which, maybe is Giardia, and just sort of, very, very memorable, both an educator and entertainer. Maybe he's sort of pioneering edutainment as we try to. And he'll be at ASTM&H, so hopefully he'll come by and everyone will get a chance to know him even better.
He was on TWiP. I'll put the link in the show notes. I can't find it at the moment, but that was quite some time ago, right, Daniel?
It was, he was funny at the last ASTM&H. I went over and I was like, Michael, how you doing? I saw you a few times. You never came over. He's like, well, now that you're so famous. I'm like, Michael, I am never too famous to hang out with you.
All right.
Now, he's probably too famous to hang out with me after this boost from the TWiP. So
there you go.
So this week we have a case submitted by the First Vienna Parasitology Passion Club, Michelle and Alexander. So Daniel, can you do the honors?
Okay, let me go ahead. I sort of navigated away from the page, so let me see if I can somehow get back to the Google page.
I think you could probably figure it out. Yeah.
You think I can figure it out? You have a lot of faith.
I don't know
in me,
about
so.
Dixon, but I know you can.
Okay,
I've got it right here. If you need,
so now I go
you
to
just
my
share it.
Google, and then I have to go to my Drive. And then once I'm on my Drive, I can actually Google my TWiP, which is not really Googling at this point. And here we are. I'm there. I was thinking this is nice. I was going to be able to just kick back and someone else would do all the work, but I will go ahead and read. So thanks to Michelle and Alexander from the First Vienna Parasitology Passion Club. We have a case presentation. A 36-year-old male presents to the local emergency department with shortness of breath. Additional symptoms included a stinging pain in the different parts of his extremities, fatigue, abdominal cramps, and bowel irregularities. On exam, he was resting comfortably and his vitals were normal, but the patient appears very distressed by his symptoms. His left eye shows signs of irritation, including redness and swelling. A detailed history reveals travel to the Caribbean about 4 years ago. Several short trips to Central and East Africa, all between 5 to 10 years ago. His initial labs were grossly unremarkable, and a chest x-ray showed no abnormalities. The patient himself suspected a specific parasitic etiology of his symptoms. So we, Alexander and Michael, or Michelle, performed a number of serological and stool examinations in search of parasitic diseases. None of the tests revealed evidence of an ongoing infection. He is HIV negative, not sexually active at the moment. He has no pets, no other recent travel history, eats a normal diet, and has been out of work for 2 years. All right. What could it be?
We can't ask any questions, unfortunately.
I wouldn't be able to answer them.
No. But
there's lots to think about.
None of the tests revealed evidence of an ongoing. It was HIV negative and not sexually active. There you go.
Okay.
But no mention of a family or anything like that.
Now, are they going to join us next time to do the unveil? Is that the plan?
Well, I will tell them what date we select and see if they can make it, right?
Okay.
Yes.
Otherwise, this will be quite a challenge to unveil if we don't know the answer.
No, at least we should have one or both of them on the show for sure. And so I will communicate with them and try and coordinate, right?
That would be great.
All right. That's TWiP 220. Show notes are at microbe.tv/TWiP. Send in your case guesses or any other questions, TWiP@microbe.tv. And as I mentioned before, if you enjoy our work, we'd appreciate your financial support, microbe.tv/contribute. Dixon Despommier is at Racaniello.org, thelivingriver.org. Thank you, Dixon. Welcome back.
You're very welcome, and it's a pleasure to return to the team.
Are you going to be on TWiV tomorrow?
You betcha.
All right. Daniel Griffin is at Columbia University Irving Medical Center, parasiteswithoutborders.com. Thank you, Daniel.
Oh, my pleasure, and everyone be safe.
Christina Nowell is at the University of Glasgow. Thank you, Christina.
Well, thank you, and have a lovely evening, everybody.
Get better.
I'm sure I will.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at microbe.tv. I'd like to thank the American Society for Microbiology for their support of TWiV and Ronald Jenkins for the music. Who's up for the outro?
I read the last one.
Daniel, would you like to do it?
Sure.
You've been listening to This Week in Parasitism. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon.
Another TWiP is parasitic.